The Australian combat mission in Afghanistan that lasted nearly 10 years and involved thousands of Australians officially ended in December. The coalition government has promised to honour an agreement signed by the previous Labor government to give Australian residency to Afghans who now fear retaliation from the Taliban for having worked with Australian forces as interpreters and in other roles. Up to 800 places have been set aside for the former Australian Defence Force employees and their direct family members in the current financial year. Ajmal Nazari worked with the ADF in Afghanistan for more than 8 years in various roles, including as an interpreter. Still in Afghanistan, he says he's been waiting 9 months so far to see if Australia will provide protection visas for himself, his pregnant wife and 3 children.
I did as much as I could for the Australians to help every single one, and I'm also glad I met so many good friends in Australian Army. So I'm still talking to many of my friends back in Australia. Still got contact like many of the soldiers back in Australia. So I still got their phone numbers and I still ring every single one. And they're a bit disappointed as well, and they can't do anything.
Mr Nazari claims to have recently received a threatening letter demanding the equivalent of $30,000 for supporting the Australian forces. He says he couldn't afford to pay such an amount, but in any case, he's still hoping his family will soon be given visas to begin lives in safety in Australia.
Australian was probably the greatest people I ever seen. The first thing probably I will go to meet all my friends that I work with and have barbecue with them, because most of them, they already invite me. They say, if you come to Australia, you're going to have a barbecue with us. So it's just like dreams, and hopefully dreams come true. And the second thing, I really like to be sitting with my beautiful kids and I watch the cricket match or anything like that.
Hamid Ali also worked with the Australian forces in southern Uruzgan province, where most Australian forces were based. He's also awaiting the outcome of an application for a protection visa in Australia, saying he would be under constant threat from the Taliban if he remains in Afghanistan. Mr Ali says he has fond memories of working with the Australian forces and was embarrassed to hear of so-called green-on-blue attacks in which Afghan soldiers attacked their foreign counterparts.
So I heard a little bit from my boss. He said one of the workers trying to attack us, but I reckon it was wrong. It wasn't right, because we were all mates. We were all sitting together. I never heard any word or anything to attack Aussies, because they were helping us. We were happy up there because my boss he was looking after us pretty good. There were 29 people or others. None of the Aussies rude to them.
Mr Ali says he is at risk without the protection of the Australian forces in Uruzgan's capital, Tarankot.
TK was pretty safe, but I don't know about the future, but it's still going fine, but I'm still not going away from TK anywhere else because it's not safe. While Aussie was here, it was safe, and I don't know about the future, mate.
The Australian Defence Association's Neil James says Australia has an obligation to protect the Afghans who worked with the ADF.
Look, the Defence Association position is quite simple. Any Afghan who had the guts to support our forces when we were over there trying to help the Afghans, and where they and their families are now in danger of repercussions from the Taliban, should be evacuated to live in Australia.
Neil James says the current situation in Afghanistan is similar to what Australia faced at the end of previous wars in Vietnam and Iraq, when it was aided by local workers. But, he says, the number of Afghan workers seeking safety in Australia could be higher because of the longer duration of the Afghan conflict.
Well, in Iraq we had a similar policy. It wasn't to the same extent, because in Al-Matana province there were less Iraqi interpreters helping us. And indeed, in that province, there were really no repercussions or little repercussions against those Iraqis who actually were working with the Australians. It was a bit more fraught in other areas of Iraq. Between Vietnam and Iraq, there was really no large operation where it was necessary to evacuate interpreters, because most of the overseas operations in that period were essentially peacekeeping or stabilisation operations, where the similar threat to people who cooperated with you in country didn't arise.
Neil James says the Whitlam Labor government received justified criticism in the early 1970s for the approach it took to former South Vietnamese who had helped Australian forces in the Vietnam War.
There was exceptionally bad feeling in the military after the Vietnam War and indeed in the Secret Intelligence Service when the Whitlam government, for quite arbitrary reasons, just refused to help any of the South Vietnamese who'd helped the Australians. There was a lot of unofficial help given when some of these people managed to escape as refugees, and they were sponsored to Australia by Australians they'd worked with, both civil and military, during the Vietnam War. But the bad feeling left over the Whitlam government's decision not to offer these people humanitarian visas persists to the present day, and it largely helps underwrite the current policy under governments of both political persuasions to never repeat that disgraceful episode.
The Office of Immigration Minister Scott Morrison has told SBS that he's unavailable for interview about the former Afghan ADF employees seeking to come to Australia. But in a statement, it says substantial progress has been made in implementing the policy to offer protection visas. The statement adds that Afghans settled in Australia have access to the same settlement services as any other humanitarian entrant. This includes accommodation support, basic assistance to set up a household, English language courses, and help to access government, community and health services. Abdul Hamid Siddiqui is an Afghan interpreter who's recently arrived in Melbourne following approval of his visa application. The 25-year-old, who worked with the Australian Forces for 2 years, says he feels extremely fortunate to be in Australia. But Mr Siddiqui feels he's been left with inadequate financial assistance to aid his resettlement, and he's still concerned about family members who were unable to join him in Australia.
I was excited and happy about myself that I got my visas, but I was depressed and about my family because they are still in danger there. So if I'm safe here, that's fine. But my family is in danger there. Right now I'm staying at my friend's house. We are searching a house to be there, and we have already lodged application there. And if we get that house, so the rent is about $500, something like that, and the government is giving us 1,000. So if I spend 500 there and 100 something like that will be my food, or 200 food, water, same these. So I've got only 400 something like that. If I save that for myself, so what to do with what to send to my family? So there's some problem.
Another former Afghan interpreter living in Melbourne is Mohammed Taher Walizada, who worked with the Australian Forces for 3 years. The 22-year-old also expected more Australian government resettlement support, including advice on services available to assist him in integrating into the community. Mr Walizada smiles as he recalls his time with his Aussie colleagues back in Afghanistan.
The experience that I learned from Australian forces, the culture, when we visit, you say, hi, g'day, mate. When we, greeting with the soldiers, say, hi, g'day, mate. Yeah.
Neil James from the Australian Defence Association says protection to the former ADF workers in Afghanistan is in the interests of both countries, and he says it's also in Australia's longer-term interest in terms of reputation.
Firstly, the moral obligation we have to these people needs to be fulfilled, because if we don't do it, they run the risk of being killed or otherwise persecuted. Secondly, there's a simple practical principle that comes into play. If we go into a future war overseas where we need to engage local people to help us as interpreters, you need to be able to assure them that if things go wrong, Australia will take steps to protect them from persecution or death. And so there's both a moral obligation and quite simply a practical advantage to having a policy of evacuating those people who help you in overseas wars.